In my last life, my world collapsed in the blinding white light at the end of a hospital corridor. My wife's colleague had called, her voice frantic, telling me Gray had a sudden cardiac arrest and was being rushed into emergency surgery. I ran 3 red lights like a man possessed, but the only thing waiting for me when I arrived was a cold, sterile death certificate. The blow was so devastating that my vision went black and I lost consciousness. By the time I woke up, Gray had already been cremated. Before the grief could even begin to swallow me whole, a lawyer from a collection agency was knocking on my front door. It was then I learned that my wife, in some secret part of her life, had racked up millions of dollars in debt. And according to her will, I was the sole heir. 10 years later, my back was permanently bent as I scavenged for trash in the forgotten corners of Chicago. A gleaming luxury car pulled up in front of me. The window rolled down, and there she was, my wife, who was supposed to have been dead for a decade. She was nestled in the arms of her first love, Victor, smiling beautifully. As if tossing a coin to a beggar, she flicked a $100 bill at me and said breezily, "Thanks for all your hard work." My body, hollowed out by a decade of debt and back-breaking labor, couldn't take that kind of shock. I dropped dead right there on that filthy street. And when I opened my eyes again, I was back on the day of Gray's cardiac arrest. "Alex, you have to try and stay strong. Take care of yourself. We did everything we could, but Gray..." The speaker was Mary, Gray's best friend and also her attending physician. She mumbled some medical jargon I couldn't comprehend, her face a mask of perfectly practiced sorrow as she helped me to the sofa. "Alex, it's better if you don't look. I'm afraid you won't be able to handle it." I ignored her, my gaze drifting past her shoulder to the reflection in the window across the room. A relatively young face stared back at me. My face. My hands were smooth, free of the ugly scars and thick calluses that had been etched there by years of hard labor. I took a few deep breaths, the sharp scent of antiseptic filling my nostrils, and finally accepted it. I had been reborn. In my previous life, I had raced to the hospital the moment I got the call about Gray, but I was still too late. I had clutched that death certificate. So consumed with regret, I wanted to bash my head through a wall, endlessly blaming myself for not driving her to work that morning. Maybe it was the overwhelming grief, or maybe I'd actually given myself a concussion, but I fainted right there in the hospital. By the time I came to, Gray was nothing but a box of cold ashes. I held her urn, refusing to eat or drink, but what arrived wasn't comfort. It was lawyers from several major lending corporations. That's when I found out that in Gray's will, I was the sole inheritor of her estate. By the time I frantically tried to sort through her finances, I discovered her company had already been sold off by my mother-in-law, Laura, leaving me with nothing but millions in debt. The court quickly foreclosed on our house, and I was left homeless. I went to Laura for help, but she slammed the door in my face. The days that followed were a living hell. I lived in a dilapidated shack, with collectors showing up almost daily. To survive, to pay off her debts, I worked 4 jobs a day, pushing through sickness because I couldn't afford a doctor. Then, 10 years later, while scavenging through garbage, I saw her. The woman who was supposed to be dead, cruising in a luxury car, laughing intimately with her first love. I rushed forward to get a better look, but she didn't even flinch. Instead, she mocked me, saying that at 40, I looked like a man of 70. She tossed a $100 bill at me, a thank you for my decade of service. I collapsed and died right there, and she drove away as if she hadn't seen a thing. As the memory flooded back, a voice in my head became crystal clear. "In the last life, you faked your death to destroy me. In this one, I'm going to make that fake death real." Mary was still trying to get me to drink a glass of water, but my mind was sharp and I pushed it away. I remembered it clearly. In my last life, I drank that water and passed out. I was almost certain it had been drugged, a tactic to ensure I would conveniently miss Gray's cremation. I set the glass down and, ignoring Mary's protests, walked directly to Gray's bedside. I pulled back the white sheet. The woman on the bed had a healthy color in her cheeks, and her breathing was far too steady for a corpse. Only the grief-stricken idiot I was in my past life could have overlooked such obvious details. I raised my hand and brought it down hard across Gray's face. She didn't even flinch. It seemed they'd used a general anesthetic to be safe. Perfect. That would make my plan even easier. Mary shrieked, assuming I had figured it all out. "Alex, you can't do that. Even if you're angry, we can explain." The agony of my past life surged through me, fueling a white-hot rage. My slaps became harder, raining down on Gray's still form. Seeing Mary on the verge of a breakdown, I instantly switched my demeanor to one of tragic, frustrated grief. "I told you not to work so late. I begged you to get checked up. Why didn't you listen to me? Now you're gone. What am I supposed to do all alone?" Mary seemed to believe I hadn't uncovered their plot, that I was just venting my sorrow in a violent way. But seeing the force of my blows, she grew worried and stammered, "Alex, please be gentle. Gray, she'll be in pain." I stopped and stared at her as if she were a complete idiot. "Mary, can a dead person person feel pain?" Mary froze, instantly regretting her words. She forced a smile that was more painful than a grimace. "No, I just meant," she trailed off, unable to form a coherent sentence. I had no time to waste on her nonsense. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number. "Hello, is this the National Organ Registry? I'd like to donate my wife's body. She just passed away. Could you please send someone over right away?" Mary tried to object, but her position as a doctor held her back. Instead, she frantically started typing a message on her own phone. The team from the donation center arrived within minutes. I put on my most grief-stricken face. My wife was always such a kind person. She passed so unexpectedly, and I want her life to continue by saving others. The coordinator from the center gripped my hand tightly. "On behalf of all the families you'll be helping, thank you. Have you decided which organs you'd like to donate?" I glanced over at Mary and sighed heavily. She died of a sudden cardiac arrest, so I'm not sure what's still viable. Why don't you just perform a full autopsy and take whatever you can? If nothing is usable, you can donate her body to the university for medical research. Mary immediately threw herself in front of the bed. "No, Alex, Gray never wanted to be an organ donor. She told me herself. We have to respect her wishes." I wiped away a non-existent tear. "Mary, I'm her husband. This is my decision to make. You are her friend, not her family. We both know who has the legal right here. Besides, you're a doctor. You know that every minute you delay, the organs become less viable. Don't you want to save lives?" "Yes, Dr. Davis, please step aside," the coordinator added. Mary still wouldn't move. I just got a hold of her mother. "You have to at least let Laura see her one last time." So she had called in reinforcements. I nodded my consent. I had no intention of actually donating Gray's organs. I knew the moment they made the first incision, they would discover she was still alive. My goal wasn't to expose her charade. It was to make it a reality. I was doing all of this to force Victor or Laura to show their hand. I wanted them to watch helplessly as Gray died for real. This would be the proof I needed to silence them if they ever tried to turn on me later. When Laura burst in, she still had curlers in her hair, looking like she'd been pulled straight from a salon chair. She saw Gray lying peacefully on the bed and visibly relaxed, then immediately spun around and slapped me hard across the face. "You useless piece of trash. Marrying you was the worst mistake of Gray's life. You've already brought her enough bad luck to kill her, and now you want to have her cut up? If anyone touches a single hair on my daughter's head today, I'll burn their entire family to the ground." Laura acted like a madwoman, physically shoving the donation coordinators out of the room. "We're not donating. Go find someone else to butcher." The staff had no choice but to leave. Mary breathed a huge sigh of relief and quickly pulled the sheet back over Gray. Laura collapsed onto the sofa and continued her tirade. "You spineless coward. Your wife dies, and instead of planning a funeral, you want to donate her body to science? You want them to cut my daughter into a million pieces? If you want to be a saint so badly, why don't you go die right now? I'll gladly donate every last part of you." I covered my stinging cheek and sighed heavily. "Laura, I'm sorry, I just thought." Before I could finish, another slap landed. "Don't think. Get out of my sight right now. I'll handle my daughter's arrangements myself." I remained silent. I obediently knelt on the floor, picked up the glass of water Mary had tried to give me earlier, and respectfully offered it to Laura. Her throat was raw from screaming, and without a second thought, she snatched it and downed the entire glass. Mary tried to stop her, but it was too late. Within minutes, Laura was fast asleep. Cold sweat beaded on Mary's forehead. She started to stammer again. "Alex, you're not still planning on the donation, are you?" I shook my head as I gently laid Laura flat on the sofa. "Of course not. She made her wishes clear. I won't push it." Mary let out a breath of relief. "Laura just collapsed. It could be serious. You should get her to the ER. I can handle the arrangements for Gray's cremation," she said, trying to get rid of me. "Absolutely not," I said firmly. "I couldn't possibly trouble you with that. You're the doctor. You know what to do. I'll leave Laura in your capable hands. I'll contact the crematorium." And right in front of her, I pulled out my phone and called Evergreen Crematorium, telling them to send a vehicle immediately. Mary tried one last time. "There's no rush for the cremation. We can wait until Laura wakes up. It's not like Gray is going anywhere." I gave her a cold stare. "Mary, Gray is dead. The living take priority over the dead. You and Gray were like sisters, yet you haven't shown a single ounce of sadness today. All you've done is say strange things. What exactly are you trying to pull?" Mary was frantic now, desperately trying to shake Laura awake, but her mother-in-law was completely unconscious. By the time the transport from the crematorium arrived to take Gray's body, Mary finally broke. She grabbed my sleeve, her voice trembling. "Alex, I think I just saw her move. Maybe we should try to resuscitate her again." I held the death certificate right in front of her face. "Mary, think very carefully before you speak again. If Gray is actually alive, what kind of liability does that create for this hospital? What kind of liability does that create for you? That's not malpractice. That's murder. I don't know if this hospital would survive that scandal, but I know you would go to prison for a very long time. So, I'll ask you again. Are you sure you saw her move?" Mary was speechless. I let out a cold laugh, shook her hand off my arm, and followed the transport vehicle. Behind me, I could hear Mary let out a choked sob, followed by the frantic sound of her dialing her phone. I looked down at Gray's body on the gurney and had to suppress a smile. In my past life, when I saw her on the street, a decade had passed, but she looked almost exactly the same. It was as if time hadn't touched her at all. I had thrown myself in front of her car, desperate to confirm it was really her, to pour out the 10 years of pain and longing. Gray had squinted, taking a long moment to place me before sneering, "Oh, it's you? It's only been 10 years. How did you manage to get older than my grandfather?" She was right. My voice was a rasp, my back was bent, and at 50, I looked ancient. I stammered, "You're not dead?" Gray and Victor, the man beside her, roared with laughter. "Of course I faked it," she said. "It was the only way to get rid of you." She didn't need to say any more. I understood everything. If she had asked for a divorce, I would have agreed. But a divorce meant splitting their assets and branding her as an adulterer. Faking her death was so much cleaner. She could leave me with all the debt, liquidate her assets, and start a new life with Victor under a new name. I was too choked with rage to speak, but Gray wasn't finished humiliating me. You know, I was awake at the hospital. I could hear everything. I can still picture you crying. I've always wondered how a grown man could sob like that. It was hilarious. As her cruel laughter echoed in my ears, I clutched my chest and collapsed. Victor exclaimed, "Honey, is he trying to pull an insurance scam? Let's get out of here." Gray muttered a curse under her breath, slammed on the accelerator, and left me to die without a second glance. My last memory was the sight of their taillights disappearing into the distance before everything went black. As I surfaced from that painful memory, I noticed something. Gray's fingers had just twitched. It seemed she was becoming aware of her situation. The anesthetic was wearing off, and she was starting to wake up. I leaned forward to the driver. "Sir, can you please step on it? My mother-in-law is trying to intercept us to have my wife's body taken for organ donation. I just want her to be laid to rest in one piece." The driver grunted in acknowledgement and floored it. I leaned over Gray, pressing my ear to her chest, listening to the steady rhythm of her heart. Then I began to say all the things I never got to say in my last life. "I know you're not dead. I know you cheated on me. I know you staged this whole thing so you could run off with Victor and leave me with your mountain of debt. But I'm not angry. I've decided to respect your choice. Since you want to be dead so badly, I'm going to help you get there. I know you can hear me. I just don't know if you can feel pain yet. I hope you can. That way you'll get to experience what it's like to be cremated. You might even be the first person in history to be consciously burned alive. You're probably wondering why I'm doing this or how I found out. None of that matters. Because for me, this day has already happened once before. In my last life, I fell for your act and live a life worse than death. So don't blame me for this. You owe me." Gray's fingers trembled. She couldn't move, but a tear escaped and rolled down her temple. I gently wiped it away. "Crying already? Save some of that for the incinerator." My phone was ringing off the hook. It was Mary and Laura, but right now I was just a grieving husband in no mood to take calls. Thanks to the driver's lead foot, we made the 30-minute drive to the crematorium in 20. Unfortunately, the crematorium was unusually busy. It would be at least an hour before it was Gray's turn. I was getting anxious, so I found the manager. "Sir, my wife died of sudden cardiac arrest. The news made my mother-in-law collapse. She's in a hospital right now, and it's not looking good. I need to get back to her side as soon as possible. Is there any way you could move my wife to the front of the line? I can't bear the thought of losing my mother-in-law too." The attendant had never seen someone try to cut the line for a cremation before. He hesitated. "I understand your situation, sir, but everyone here is waiting. It's against policy." He said that, but his hand subtly made a gesture for money. I knew I was running out of time. I pulled out my phone and sent him a $2,000 payment. "Please, sir, I'm an orphan. My wife and her mother are the only family I've ever had. I can't lose her too." The money worked. Gray was moved to the front of the line and wheeled towards the cremation chamber within 10 minutes. Just as the attendant reached for the ignition button, I stopped him. I couldn't let him be an accessory to this. This was my revenge to take. After I insisted, the attendant reluctantly agreed to let me press the button myself. At that exact moment, the frantic voices of Laura and Mary echoed from the entrance. "Stop, stop, don't do it." Laura, still groggy from the sedative, or perhaps just overcome with shock, collapsed in the doorway. "Stop, get my daughter out of there." Just as my finger was about to press the button, Mary grabbed my hand. "Alex, wait." Laura wants to say one last thing to her. Laura, gasping for breath, screamed, "Get away from there. You are not burning my daughter. Get her out of there right now." Even now, at the very last second, they were still trying to maintain the charade. I dropped to my knees, my voice thick with feigned grief. "Laura, Gray is gone. Please let her rest in peace. I'm her husband. I'm not leaving her side." Our commotion was starting to draw a crowd. The attendant muttered, "What is this? Some kind of soap opera? This is a crematorium, not a stage." Annoyed, he reached for the button himself. Panicked, Laura and Mary lunged forward to stop him, their faces masks of pure, twisted desperation. The attendant, startled, instinctively jumped back. Laura and Mary couldn't stop their momentum and crashed forward, their combined weight slamming down on the ignition button. With a roar, the chamber erupted in flames, instantly engulfing Gray. Two piercing screams ripped through the air. Everyone's attention snapped to Laura and Mary. But my eyes were locked on the viewing window of the cremation chamber on Gray. The anesthetic must have completely worn off by now. Through the flames, I could just make out her mouth opening in a silent scream, her arms reaching up. But with all the commotion, no one else noticed. After a minute, the onlookers finally turned their attention back to the chamber. One of the attendants pointed at the window, whispering in amazement. I've never seen the arms reach that high before. It's almost like she's alive. I know, right? Usually you just get a little muscle contraction. If it were nighttime, I'd think we had a zombie on our hands. I wiped away another fake tear, fighting to keep the smile off my face. In a tone full of pity, I said, my wife loved her mother more than anything. She must have heard Laura's voice and was trying to sit up to see her one last time. I dabbed at my eyes and spoke towards the chamber. Rest in peace, my darling wife. Don't you worry. I'll take good care of your mother. I'll make sure she joins you soon. And just as I finished speaking, Gray's arms fell limp as if she had finally, truly died. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the weight of my past life finally lift. Mary, ignoring the unconscious Laura on the floor, stumbled over to the chamber. The sight inside seemed to shatter her completely. She started frantically mashing the control panel. Why won't it stop? Somebody put out the fire. The attendants, having never dealt with such a hysterical family member, pulled Mary away. Ma'am, we understand you're grieving, but the dead can't be brought back. You're disturbing her final rest. He's right, the other added. It's a fully automated system. Once it starts, the cycle can't be interrupted. You need to calm down. Mary's face was ashen. She slumped to the floor, muttering, it's over. It's all over. Then she looked up at me, her eyes full of accusation. Alex, we called you. Why didn't you answer your phone? I sighed. I was too distraught. I couldn't bring myself to talk to anyone. All I could think about was that Gray was gone and my life was over. Besides, cremation is the normal procedure. Why were you two trying so desperately to stop it? Laura, who had come to, crawled over and began clawing at my pants. You murderer. You killed my daughter. You give me back my daughter. I sighed again, but made no move to help her up. Instead, I held up the death certificate. Laura, I know you're upset, but Gray's death had nothing to do with me. She died of a cardiac arrest. If you don't believe me, you can ask Mary. She's the one who tried to save her. She's the one who signed this certificate. Isn't that right, Mary? I turned to look at Mary. She was trapped. If she said Gray wasn't dead, she'd have to explain the death certificate. If she said Gray was dead, Laura would attack her. Seeing her hesitation, Laura lunged and wrapped her hands around Mary's throat. It was you. You killed my daughter. She was alive, and you signed that paper. Now she's dead because of you. I cover my mouth in mock horror. What? Laura, what are you saying? Gray wasn't dead. I whipped my head back toward the chamber. That explains it. I thought I saw her fingers twitch just before she went in. I told myself I was just seeing things, but it was real. At my words, Mary grabbed her own hair in despair. After a moment of intense internal conflict, she finally broke. It's true. Gray wasn't dead. She was just under anesthesia. If you had all been just a few minutes later, she would have woken up. I decided to add more fuel to the fire. So you're saying Gray was burned alive? And she was conscious for it. The statement was so horrific that everyone present froze in shock. The attendant's face went white as a sheet. No wonder he stammered. No wonder she raised her arms when the flames started. My God, that's murder. Hearing this, Laura's eyes rolled back in her head and she passed out cold. I reacted instantly, slapping Mary hard across the face. Mary, are you insane? How can you joke about something like that? My wife is gone, and you're telling these horrible lies. The slap dazed her. I'm not lying. I sneered. Not lying? Then tell me, why was my wife under anesthesia? And why did you sign a legal death certificate? If you're going to lie, at least make it a good one. Mary didn't know how to respond. The onlookers, assuming she was just a hysterical woman making things up, began to disperse. When the cremation cycle was complete, I angrily collected the box of ashes and left. Before I walked out, I said to Mary, you scared Laura so badly she fainted. You should probably get her to a hospital. It wasn't that I didn't want to be there for the fireworks when Laura woke up. I just had more important business to attend to. I placed Gray's ashes in the most prominent spot in our living room. Then I immediately called my lawyer to begin the process of executing the will and inheriting Gray's company and assets. Last time, I was too lost in grief to act, and by the time I came to my senses, everything was gone. This time, I had to move move before Laura could interfere. I couldn't afford to waste this second chance. After getting the legal process started, I thought about the millions in debt. Knowing Gray, she wouldn't have just handed the cash over to Victor or Laura. I had checked her accounts before, and the money wasn't there. She must have stashed it somewhere. I went through her credit card statements and found a recurring charge for a storage unit across town. I went to the address, and sure enough, inside was a duffel bag stuffed with cash. I immediately went to the bank and paid off enough of the outstanding loans to get the collectors off my back. With everything settled, I lounged on the sofa with a glass of red wine and smiled at the wedding photo of Gray on the wall. Thank you, my dear wife. I now have a house, a company, and no debt to my name. I promise I'll enjoy this life far more than you enjoyed yours. I drank until I passed out on the sofa. The next morning, a sharp knock on the door woke me. I opened it, my head pounding from the hangover, to find Mary and Laura standing on my doorstep. With them was a man a few years older than me. It was Victor. His face was a mask of fury. He was holding the hand of a boy who looked to be about 6 or 7, a boy who had Gray's eyes. A child from before our marriage. No wonder she had always refused to have children with me. She already had one with her first love. All three of them looked exhausted, with dark circles under their eyes. And behind them stood 2 police officers. The moment they were inside, Laura pointed a trembling finger at me. "Officer, that's him. He's the one who burned my daughter alive. Arrest him, burn him, and see how he likes it." I had expected this, just not so soon. I sighed. "Laura, please, stop making these terrible jokes." I handed the death certificate to one of the officers. "Officer, this is my wife's official death certificate. My mother-in-law has taken a loss very hard. I'm afraid her mental state is fragile." The officer examined the document. "This appears to be in order." I sighed again. My wife and I were married for 3 years. We were very happy. When she died, I couldn't bear the thought of her body decomposing, so I had her cremated immediately. "Is that a crime?" Laura clutched her chest. "You're lying. My daughter couldn't stand the sight of you. If Victor had been able to get a divorce back then, she never would have married you out of spite. You did this on purpose. You rushed the cremation so you could get your hands on her company and her money. I already checked with her office yesterday." I put on a look of utter disbelief, letting my eyes well up with tears. "Laura, you can insult me all you want, but what I felt for Gray was real. If she didn't love me, why would she make me the sole beneficiary of her will?" That stopped her. I pressed my advantage. "You claim Gray was alive. Are you saying a major hospital like Chicago General can't tell the difference between a living person and a dead one? Mary herself told me Gray was brain dead and had no heartbeat. Does that sound like someone who is alive?" Laura gestured for Mary to speak, but Mary just stared at the floor. I couldn't blame her. If she admitted to falsifying a death certificate, her career would be over and she'd face prison time. It was easier to just let the lie stand. The room fell into a tense silence. Victor pulled on Laura's sleeve, and she finally stopped screaming. He spoke up. "Gray wasn't dead. I'm her boyfriend. We broke up years ago because of a misunderstanding, and she only married you to get back at me. I recently finalized my divorce, and I came back for her with our son. She realized she was still in love with me and wanted to fake her death to leave you without a messy confrontation. But you killed her." Victor paused. "Don't blame her. She was only doing it because she didn't want to hurt you. She was a kind person. Now that she's gone, all we want is for you to do the right thing by her son and give him his inheritance." I took a sip of water and mimicked Laura's shrill tone. "You're lying." Then I turned to Laura, my expression full of sorrow. "Laura, I know you and Gray didn't always see eye to eye. I know she didn't leave you anything in her will. Is that why you're doing this? Did you bring this child here to slander her memory just so you could get a piece of her estate?" Laura looked like she was about to explode, but the thought of the money made her restrain herself. "That's a lie. Gray and I were very close. And this is her son, I'd swear on it." I pulled out a copy of Gray's will. "Then why are you lying, Laura? If you two were so close, why isn't your name mentioned anywhere in her will? Why did she leave everything to me?" Laura was speechless. Victor hesitated too. He could hardly admit that Gray left me everything so I'd be on the hook for her debts. I glanced at the boy standing behind him and laughed to myself. So that was it. The reason my perfect wife of 3 years had suddenly decided to drop the act was because her first love and their son had come back into the picture. But having already died once, I no longer felt any pain. I said calmly, "If you claim this boy is Gray's son, then you'll need to provide proof. A legally binding DNA test, for example, or a birth certificate." Victor and Laura both froze. "We don't have a DNA test. He was a home birth, so there's no certificate. But he is her son." I held up my hands. "Officers, do you see what's happening here? They know my wife has been cremated, so there's no way to disprove their claim. They bring this child here to try and get her money, and they invent this wild story about me murdering her to strengthen their case. None of it adds up." Laura grew desperate. "I could take a DNA test with the boy. That will prove I'm his grandmother, which will prove he's Gray's son." The officer shook his head. "I'm afraid not, ma'am. That would only prove you and the boy are related. It wouldn't legally establish a link between him and the deceased." I had to suppress a smile. This was one of the main reasons I had rushed the cremation. To make sure there was no body left to test. It looked like my foresight had paid off. Laura and Victor exchanged a look. Victor gritted his teeth. Forget about the boy for a minute. The point is, Gray wasn't dead. He burned her alive. He's a murderer, and he can't be allowed to inherit her estate. He wasn't wrong, but first he had to prove it. I suddenly turned my gaze on Mary. Mary, why don't you tell them? Was Gray dead or alive? You're a doctor. You have a husband and a family. You should think very carefully before you answer. You may not recall, but I do. It was you and Laura who physically pressed the ignition button. If Gray was alive, that makes you murderers too. I had reframed their desperate attempt to stop the cremation as a deliberate act. Laura was too stunned to even protest. Mary gritted her teeth, avoiding eye contact with Laura and Victor. She was dead. I let out a breath, but then Victor held up his phone. I had a feeling you'd lie. That's why I brought proof. He played a video. On the screen, he, Gray, Mary, and Laura were all sitting on a sofa, planning the entire fake death scheme. Gray's voice, just as sickening as I remembered it, came from the phone's speaker. I'll be under anesthesia. You just have to drug my husband and convince him I've been cremated. When it's all over, I'll give you $1 million. The video was incomplete. It didn't include the part where they planned to saddle me with her death. Mary sank to the floor, completely lost. I don't know. Victor looked relieved. See, I wasn't lying. You murdered Gray. You should be in prison, and her inheritance should go to her mother. I let my face crumple in horror, saying nothing, letting the emotion build. This time, the grief had to look real. Officer, I finally choked out. I want to file a report. These three conspired to fake my wife's death, and they never told me. I was so overcome with grief that I didn't realize she was still alive. I pointed a shaking finger at Mary and Laura. They knew I was planning to donate her organs. They knew I was taking her to be cremated, but they never told me she was alive. They did it on purpose. They wanted to use me to kill her so they could get their hands on her money. I turned on Laura and Victor. As far as I knew, my wife was dead. I followed standard procedure and had her cremated. Did I do anything wrong? No. They were stunned by my clarity. They had expected me to break down, to be an easy target, but I had already died once. I was no longer the naive fool from my past life. From the moment I woke up, I knew exactly what I had to do. I continued, my voice thick with emotion. I tried to donate her organs. Laura, you were there. Why didn't you tell me the truth then? If all she wanted was a divorce, I would have given it to her. You all manipulated her, made her believe this insane plan was a good idea. And then you stood by and let me, her husband, be the one to send her to the incinerator. How could you be so cruel? Laura stammered. It was Gray's idea. She insisted that you had to believe she was really dead. That's why I had to stop the donation without telling you the truth. I held up my phone. And what about this? My call log shows you called me repeatedly while I was on my way to the crematorium. You knew exactly where I was going. I was too upset to answer, but why didn't you send a single iMessage? When you arrived, she still hadn't been cremated. You had time to tell the truth. Instead, you created a chaotic scene that ended with you pressing the button yourselves. Laura and Mary had nothing to say. I knew what they had been thinking. They assumed they could stall me long enough to get Gray out of there and complete their plan. It was an act of pure desperation. The argument went nowhere, with both sides sticking to their stories. In the end, the police took all of us down to the station for questioning. After a few days of investigation, the police concluded that I was exactly what I appeared to be, a devoted husband who was completely oblivious to his wife's affair. I never questioned her business trips or late nights at the office. I never looked at her phone. Our friends, neighbors, and colleagues all testified that we were a happy, loving couple. Even our home security footage showed we never fought. They had no way of knowing I had been reborn. Based on the evidence, there was no way a man who adored his wife so much could have murdered her. In contrast, the stories told by Laura, Mary, and Victor were riddled with inconsistencies. They had countless opportunities to tell me Gray was alive, but they chose to wait until after she was cremated. Mary and Laura, in particular, had watched her being loaded into the chamber and said nothing. They even pushed the button themselves. They claimed it was an accident, but who was going to believe that? On top of that, the conspiracy to fake a death was a serious crime in itself. The investigation concluded that I was an innocent and grieving victim. The other three, however, were charged with conspiracy to commit murder. 6 months later, they were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Laura wasn't so lucky. When the verdict was read, she had a massive heart attack and died right there in the courtroom. Mary's husband divorced her and took the kids. I heard she attempted suicide several times in prison, but never succeeded. As for Victor, he tried to contact me a few times, begging me to visit. When I ignored him, he started writing letters, pleading with me to raise his son for Gray's sake. I wrote him one letter back. I told him the boy was in a state orphanage. I'm no saint. I couldn't raise the son of the man who conspired to murder my wife. I sold our old house and used the money from Gray's estate to buy a much larger one in a better part of the city. I still keep Gray's ashes with me. I'm sure that if there is another life, she'll be able to see just how happy I am now.